One waitress, one arrogant billionaire, and a grand piano. What began as a cruel joke, a public attempt to humiliate her, quickly spiraled into something no one saw coming. The moment she touched the keys, the entire room fell silent. Not out of pity, not out of politeness, but out of sheer, undeniable awe. It was a warm Friday evening at the Bellamy, an upscale restaurant in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina. The air buzzed with quiet conversations, the occasional clink of fine china, and the smooth, velvety notes of a jazz trio tucked into the corner. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in soft golden light, while pristine white tablecloths and a wine list longer than a mortgage payment whispered of wealth and exclusivity. In the midst of it all, Clara Mitchell moved like clockwork, balancing trays, refilling glasses, and offering a warm, practiced smile to patrons who barely saw her. Just another waitress, just another uniform. But Clara was more than that. She had a dream, one bigger than this restaurant, bigger than this night. What she didn't know was that tonight was the night her entire world would change. Clara's passion wasn't waiting tables, it was music. Ever since she was a child, the piano had been her refuge, a place where every emotion, every unspoken thought, found a voice and melody. But dreams don't pay rent. Long shifts at the Bellamy were a necessity, a stepping stone toward the music conservatory she longed to attend. Few knew about her talent, except for the other restaurant staff, who had occasionally caught her stealing quiet moments at the weathered baby grand tucked in the storage room. During breaks, when no one was looking, her fingers would dance across the keys, letting out pieces of a world she had yet to share. That night, as the evening rush began to die down, the heavy doors swung open, and in walked Preston Langley. Instantly recognizable, the real estate mogul carried himself like a man who owned the city, not just a few buildings in it. Flanked by an entourage of equally polished companions, he exuded an air of casual arrogance. Preston was the kind of man who didn't just occupy a room, he commanded it. The waitstaff instinctively straightened their postures. Preston was not an easy guest. He was known for his sharp tongue, his impossible standards, and worst of all, his love for public humiliation disguised as humor. Clara's co-workers exchanged subtle glances, silently dreading the table assignment. But to her, he was just another seat to serve, another order to take. At least, that's what she thought. As Preston scanned the room, his gaze landed on Clara. A moment's pause, then a smirk. She felt his eyes on her, but she ignored it, keeping her focus on clearing empty plates and refilling wine glasses. But Preston wasn't done with her. He had already decided tonight she was going to be his entertainment. Clara had grown up in a quiet town outside Savannah, Georgia, where dreams of grandeur felt as distant as the city lights on the horizon. Raised by a single mother who worked long shifts as a nurse, she had learned early on that hard work wasn't optional, it was survival. But music had been her one constant. Her mother's old record player, the weathered piano gifted by a kind neighbor, the nights spent playing melodies while the world outside went quiet, those were the moments that shaped her. That piano became her escape, and tonight, it was about to become something more. While other kids spent their afternoons racing bikes down sunlit streets, Clara spent hers at the piano. She had no formal lessons, no prestigious teacher, just her ears and her hands, mimicking melodies from the radio before venturing into classical pieces she discovered in secondhand music books. Her talent didn't go unnoticed. She played at church services, school recitals, and community gatherings, captivating audiences with a grace that seemed beyond her years. But talent alone doesn't pay tuition. By the time she turned 18, reality had settled in like a heavy fog. A professional music career would have to wait. The scholarships she had pinned her hopes on never materialized. Family responsibilities took precedence. The dream of conservatory halls and concert stages was packed away, replaced with the immediate need to make a living. Yet, she never fully let go. The piano wasn't just a dream, it was who she was. When she moved to Charleston a few years ago, she took a job at the Bellamy, not just for the paycheck, but for something else, something most customers never even noticed. A grand piano, tucked into the corner of the dining room. She rarely had time to play it, but just knowing it was there brought her comfort. Music hadn't left her, it was simply waiting. That night, as Preston Langley and his entourage took their seats, Clara approached their table, balancing a tray with practiced grace. Preston ordered a top-shelf bourbon, tossing in a joke loud enough for nearby tables to hear. The kind of joke meant to amuse his friends and embarrass someone else. Clara, ever professional, offered a polite smile, her voice steady despite the unsettling energy radiating from him. "Clara, huh?" Preston mused, his gaze flicking to her name tag. "Sounds like someone with a lot of hidden talents." The comment caught her off guard. She met his eyes for a fraction of a second before nodding politely and stepping away to place their orders. She had no idea the night was only getting started. She didn't notice the knowing smirk Preston exchanged with his companions, nor the way his eyes trailed her every move. But Preston wasn't just watching, he was planning. And soon, Clara would find herself at the center of a spectacle she never asked for. The night carried on like any other, the hum of clinking glasses, soft jazz, and low laughter filling the air. Clara moved with practiced ease, keeping her focus sharp and her pace steady. She avoided Preston's gaze as she worked the floor, but his presence lingered like an unwelcome shadow. She'd dealt with difficult guests before, but something about him felt different, not just rude, but calculated. By the time the appetizers arrived, Preston had already begun his performance, though not the kind Clara expected. He held court at his table, loudly spinning tales of his own success, casually throwing in jabs about people who lack ambition. His entourage laughed on cue, while other diners exchanged irritated glances. Clara tried to tune it out, staying focused on her tasks. But as she returned to his table with a bottle of wine, Preston pounced. "Tell me, Clara," he called out, his voice cutting through the din, "what do you do when you're not carrying trays? Surely a young woman like you has dreams." The question stopped her mid-step. Clara hesitated. "Careful, keep it short, keep it safe." "I play piano sometimes," she said, her voice deliberately light. She hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Preston's eyes lit up. A slow, knowing smile curled at his lips. "A pianist, huh? Fascinating." He leaned forward, tapping a finger against his glass. "Why don't you give us a little performance?" Clara froze. The air shifted. A few nearby tables turned to watch. "Oh, I couldn't," she said quickly, forcing a polite laugh. "I'm just here to work tonight." But Preston wasn't about to let it go. "Nonsense," he declared, raising his glass. "There's a piano right there. Show us what you've got. Surely a future star like you isn't afraid of a little audience." His companions chuckled, enjoying the show. Other diners glanced over, curious about the commotion. Clara's pulse quickened. The heat of their stares weighed on her, waiting, judging. She wanted to say no. She wanted to turn and walk away. But Preston's challenge hung in the air, daring her to rise to it or crumble beneath it. "I really shouldn't," Clara stammered, glancing around for an escape. But no one intervened, not even her co-workers. Preston leaned back in his chair, swirling his bourbon with a smirk. "Ah, I see," he said, voice thick with mock disappointment. "All talk, no talent. That's a shame." The words hit like a slap. Clara's hands clenched at her sides. And just like that, the decision was made. Clara wasn't one to seek confrontation, but the way Preston brushed her off like a joke, like she was insignificant, cut deeper than she expected. Her mother's words surfaced in her mind, steady and unwavering. "Never let anyone make you small, Clara. You are bigger than they will ever know." A tense silence stretched between them. Clara's gaze flickered to the piano, then back to Preston. His smug grin dared her to take the bait, and against her better judgment, she did. "Fine," she said, her voice steady but low. "I'll play." A quiet ripple of anticipation swept through the dining room as Clara moved toward the piano. Each step felt like it carried the weight of both fear and defiance. The space seemed to hold its breath. The soft glow of the chandeliers cast a spotlight on her, isolating her from the murmuring crowd. Her fingers trembled as she slid onto the bench. The polished keys gleamed under the lights, a challenge waiting to be met. Behind her, Preston leaned back in his chair, the very picture of smug satisfaction, like he had already won whatever game this was. Clara closed her eyes. Her heart pounded so loud she could barely think. This wasn't the church recitals she used to play in. This wasn't the warm community halls filled with kind faces. This was different. This was hostile, but there was no turning back now. She exhaled, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. The first notes were soft, tentative, almost fragile. A few diners shifted in their seats. Someone coughed in the back of the room. Clara ignored them. Her fingers moved with quiet precision, her focus sharpening as she leaned into the music. She had one shot. She chose a piece she knew by heart, a soulful rendition of Clair de Lune by Debussy. The melody unfurled into the room, weaving through the air like silk, delicate but unyielding. As her confidence grew, the music swelled. Her hands moved like water, her body swaying with the rhythm, the notes pouring out like a confession. Each chord held a piece of her story, the sacrifices her mother made. The nights spent practicing in a cramped apartment, fingers aching but refusing to stop. The weight of a dream deferred but never abandoned. The diners fell silent, the clinking of glasses stopped. Even Preston, who had been whispering to his companions just moments ago, went still. Clara didn't need to look at him to feel the shift in the room. The mocking energy had vanished, replaced by something she couldn't quite name. Maybe awe, maybe humility. The music soared, and Clara let herself go. For the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't a waitress. She wasn't a struggling dreamer. She was simply herself, an artist. Her fingers danced across the keys, pulling out emotions so raw, so vivid, they seemed to linger in the air like smoke. And then, the final chord, the last note rang out, stretching into the silence, filling the space with something unspoken but deeply felt. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No clinking glasses, no murmured conversations, no smug laughter from Preston Langley, just stillness. Clara sat frozen, her hands still resting on the keys, her breath shallow. And then, the room erupted. The applause came like a wave, rolling through the restaurant, loud and full of something electric. Some diners stood, their claps sharp, unreserved, filled with something real. Her co-workers, who had been watching from the sidelines, joined in, faces lit with pride. For the first time in years, Clara wasn't invisible. Preston, however, remained seated. The smirk was gone, his expression unreadable. Shock, discomfort, maybe both. He raised his hands and clapped slowly, the sound hollow against the thunderous applause. But even his hesitant recognition couldn't overshadow what had just happened. Because Clara had taken back her voice. And no amount of arrogance could take that away. As the applause began to fade, the room exhaled, as if releasing a collective breath it didn't realize it had been holding. Clara stood, her knees unsteady, but her back straight. She let her gaze sweep the crowd. And for the first time that evening, she truly saw them not as spectators, but as witnesses. Their faces held something new. Admiration, respect, even a hint of awe. She didn't look at Preston right away. Instead, she acknowledged the diners who had clapped the loudest, offering them a small, polite nod, her lips curving into the faintest smile. It wasn't pride she felt, it was relief. Relief that she hadn't let fear silence her. But then, as if pulled by some unseen force, her gaze shifted to him, Preston Langley. He sat motionless, hands clasped in front of him on the table. The confidence, the bravado, the smirk, all of it was gone. What was left was a man who couldn't decide whether to acknowledge his mistake or double down on it. "Well," Preston finally said, his voice louder than necessary, breaking the delicate silence. "That was unexpected." He chuckled lightly, but the sound lacked its usual bravado. "I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places." The words landed with a dull thud. His companions exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him. The comment was meant to be an olive branch, but it was hollow, weighed down by his inability to truly own the moment. She didn't need his approval. She never had. "Thank you," Clara said, her tone steady and deliberate. No warmth, no hostility, just a simple, undeniable truth. She wasn't about to let Preston Langley pull her back into the smallness he had tried to impose. Her music had spoken louder than any rebuttal ever could. Preston cleared his throat, shifting in his seat, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of the room's collective gaze. He gestured toward the waiter for another drink, a flimsy attempt to regain his composure. "You've got quite a gift," he muttered, almost begrudgingly. Clara met his gaze. Unwavering, unapologetic. She nodded once. "Everyone has a gift," she said, her words measured, deliberate. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." The room stilled again. A quiet ripple passed through the air, not loud, not aggressive, but sharp enough to leave a mark. Preston shifted, his usual air of dominance slipping further with each passing second. People began turning back to their meals, but the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Where there had once been the quiet hum of privilege and pretense, there was now something richer, a shared understanding, perhaps even respect, for the waitress who had just reminded everyone of the power of authenticity. But Preston wasn't just humiliated, he was exposed. And no amount of charm or quick wit could shield him from the truth. Because now, everyone in the room saw him clearly. Clara stepped away from the piano, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. Her colleagues met her with quiet smiles, subtle nods of encouragement as she returned to her station. She still had a job to finish. But something inside her had changed. Her head was held higher. Her movements were more deliberate, more certain. She wasn't just a waitress tonight. She was Clara Mitchell, and they all knew it. Preston's table had gone silent. His entourage, who had laughed so freely at her expense earlier, now avoided eye contact. The bravado that had once filled their corner of the restaurant gone, all that remained was an awkward, lingering silence. The night carried on, but Clara felt lighter. Each step through the dining room felt different, more purposeful, more intentional. She had walked in feeling like just another server. She was walking out as something else entirely. As she refilled glasses and cleared plates, diners stopped her. A soft hand touched her arm. "You're incredible," an older woman murmured, her eyes warm. Clara set down a coffee cup, blinking in surprise. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving," another man added, his voice thick with sincerity. "You've got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Clara smiled, a quiet, knowing curve of her lips. For the first time in a long time, she didn't just believe in her dream. She knew it was real. Clara thanked them with quiet humility, her heart swelling with something deeper than gratitude. These weren't just compliments. They were validations of everything she had worked for, of everything she had dreamed of becoming. Preston, however, was not so gracious. As Clara approached his table to deliver the check, he looked up at her, his expression hovering somewhere between annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he muttered, his tone clipped. "No need to rub it in." Clara paused. She met his gaze directly, unflinching. "It was never about proving anything to you," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I just wanted to play." Preston had no response. His fingers fidgeted against his glass, his once commanding presence reduced to an awkward shuffle. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone at the table knew it. As Preston hastily scribbled his signature on the check, one of his companions, a younger man with softer eyes, a little less arrogance than the rest, looked at Clara. "You were amazing, truly." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. And for the first time, Clara saw a flicker of humanity in a group she had written off as shallow and untouchable. She nodded, "Thank you," a small smile. Then she turned and walked away. The night ended with Preston and his entourage leaving quietly, their usual grand exit replaced by a hasty retreat. Clara watched them go, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness. Because she wasn't thinking about Preston anymore. Her mind was already on the next step. The tips that night were unusually generous enough to cover her rent and leave a little extra for piano lessons she had been postponing. As she locked up and stepped into the crisp night air, a thought settled deep inside her, one she hadn't felt in years. Certainty. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a dreamer. She was an artist. And nothing, not mockery, not financial struggles, not fear could take that away from her. Later that night, in her small apartment, Clara sat at the worn bench of her old upright piano. The sound wasn't as crisp or rich as the grand piano at the Bellamy, but it didn't matter. The music still came from her heart, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. In the days that followed, the events of that night became a story whispered through the city. Patrons who had witnessed her performance shared the tale, and word began to spread. Then, a few days later, a phone call. A man who had been dining at the Bellamy that night. A music producer from Nashville. He wasn't offering fame or fortune. He wasn't offering fame or fortune, but he was offering something else. A chance to record a demo. A chance to step toward a future she had only dared to dream of. Clara said yes. Not because she believed it would change her life overnight, but because it felt like a door opening, one she wasn't afraid to walk through. For years, she had let fear and doubt whisper their lies, telling her she wasn't enough, that her dreams were too big. But now she saw the truth, her resilience, her authenticity. They weren't weaknesses, they were her greatest strengths. The incident with Preston Langley wasn't just a humiliating spectacle turned victory. It was a reminder that integrity always wins. Preston, for all his wealth and bravado, had nothing that could diminish her. He represented every voice of doubt she had ever faced, and she had silenced him not with anger, not with words, but with the purity of her craft. To anyone watching her story, Clara's message was clear. Never let someone else define your worth. The world is full of Preston Langley's people who project their own insecurities onto others just to feel powerful. But true power, it comes from staying rooted in who you are. From letting your passion speak louder than their ridicule. As Clara closed the piano lid, resting her hands on the faded wood, she smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like it had truly begun. And now, a question for you. What dream have you been holding back on because of fear or doubt? Don't wait for someone like Preston to test you. Take your step forward now. If Clara's story inspired you, subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph, because your story, it could be next